All right. Everybody, today I'm speaking with Hamza Dujan, who's the student at the Islamic University of Minnesota, and he holds an MA in Islamic Studies from the University of Chicago. He has a YouTube channel, Hamza the Historian, and we're going to talk about the history of Islam, obviously. So thank you, Hamza, for stopping by and being here with us today.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here.
Definitely. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your background. Are you a born Muslim or are you a revert? Because I guess you're from the States. So maybe you can give us some insights into that and then maybe something about your academic background. Yeah, would be great to have.
Sure. Yeah. So I am a convert to Islam. I don't like the term revert, and there's reasons for
Mhm.
that. Some people like it, but it's problematic when you try to talk about it in Arabic, because in
Mhm.
Arabic the word revert also means apostate.
Okay.
So I prefer to use more indigenous Islamic vocabulary. But yes, I did convert, or I became Muslim, or I submitted, or however you want to say it.
Right.
I entered Islam, and that was in 2010. And so I've been Muslim pretty close to 11 years. It'll be 11 years next month.
Mhm.
Um, and shortly after I converted, I enrolled at the Islamic University of Minnesota. And so I did like undergraduate studies there. I did a bachelor's in linguistics at the same time. So I was doing both of them together. And then I did a master's in Islamic studies at the Islamic University of Minnesota, which is like a traditional madrasa, more or less, Arab style madrasa. And then I left that program to do the master's at the University of Chicago because they offered me a scholarship, and it's one
Mhm.
of the top 10 universities in America. So it's like an opportunity, just could not pass up to get a scholarship there. It's a very, very expensive school. Bill Gates' son was going there when I was there, that type of school. So I didn't fit in because I came from a really poor background, but I enjoyed my time there and learned a lot. And right now, with the pandemic, frankly, schools weren't taking PhD students, and Islamic University of Minnesota was the only one that was. So that's where I'm at, and I
Mhm.
enjoy it because that's what I'm familiar with and been there, and for the undergrad and master's programs. So I'm
Nice.
enjoying it.
Yeah. So you've been a Muslim for over 11 years. I mean, you have a pretty good context. By the way, in which part of Minnesota are you?
Right now, I live in central Minnesota, but I was originally born in Minneapolis. I used
Mhm.
to live actually not far from where the George Floyd murder took place. I think most people outside of Minnesota, they don't know too that the Cup Food store there was a halal store owned by Arabs, and it has a masjid in the basement. So he was killed in front of a masjid. So the Muslims here took
Mhm.
it very personally.
Yeah, I didn't know that. But I lived in Minnesota for 4 months. I lived in Prior Lake, which
Oh
is
wow,
like a
okay.
very small town.
Uh-huh.
And there's a lake, obviously. It's called Prior Lake, and there's a bunch of lakes in Minnesota. But I
Yeah.
lived there 7 years ago. Yeah, and
Cool.
I visited all over Minnesota, so I know the place pretty well. I was doing a waiter at this Captain's Jack restaurant, it was called. So I was waiting tables there as a student. Yeah.
Wow.
I'm obviously from Europe, so I was like an exchange guy.
Are you
Uh,
from Prague originally?
no, I'm from Slovakia, which is a different
Okay.
country. This is Czech Republic where I live. We used to be Czechoslovakia. It's pretty complicated, but
Sure.
uh, it's very similar. Kind of, it's like Canada and US basically, just in
Hmm.
Europe. Yeah.
Yeah, the beret that I'm wearing is actually Radiovka from the Czech Republic.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, that's very famous here. It's like a traditional style. And so I just side note, maybe why did you decide to maybe convert? Just like what was the main reason for you back in 2010? Because I'm a fresh, convert, revert, whatever you want to call it, from just a few months ago, earlier this year. I mean, I studied Islam before, but I took my Shahada not that long ago, before Ramadan. So, what was your process like? Did you study Islam before you converted, or how did you decide to do it?
Well, basically, it's a long story. I'll try to give it to you summarized. Ever since I was a little kid, I was very interested in religion. My parents raised me Lutheran Christian. My parents are mostly Scandinavian. My mom's pretty much 100% Norwegian, and my dad's
Mhm.
Swedish mixed with English and some other stuff. And but I remember never accepting the Trinity. That was always very problematic for me. I remember being in church, and when they would pray directly to Jesus, I would be replacing it in my head with God. So I'd be saying God in my mind instead. And I was always the troublemaker at Sunday school, asking all the different theological questions that the teacher didn't know how to answer. And when I got older, I got like when I was 12 years old, maybe 13, I got very interested in learning German because I have family in Munich, and they would come to visit. And so, because basically my grandmother's brother, he grew up in Minnesota. He joined the military. They stationed him in Germany. He stayed there, married a German woman, and they had kids, and he's got grandkids. So they come back always to visit Minnesota. And through learning German, I also got interested in German philosophy. And so, I liked reading Hegel or Kant or any of those type of Enlightenment philosophers and things like that. And what ended up happening is I became more of a deist, believed in God, but I wasn't so sure about the scripture because I'd been also looking into biblical criticism in the manuscripts and how they all differ with each other, contradict each other. Things were added and taken away, and so many different versions of the Bible. And then I eventually started kind of drifting towards agnosticism and eventually full-blown atheism. And around this time, I was entering college.
Mhm.
And I was very interested in learning different languages and different cultures. I did really well studying German in high school. I studied some French. I studied some Chinese. I was just into learning different languages, some Swahili. And because of that, I joined the Multicultural Club, it was called, when I was in college. And I became president of the club eventually. And I was very interested in what's the impact on the world religions on culture. So I started looking into all the different world religions, and also I had to disprove them, because I'm atheist. And I pretty much researched every religion except Islam. I said, oh, those guys attacked us on 9/11. They're a bunch of terrorists, kiss the ground 5 times a day. They worship a big black box in the middle of the desert. I know these guys. I don't need to go read about them.
Yeah.
And then I was friends, though, with a YouTuber, because I have a YouTube channel called Hamza the Linguist
Mhm.
that I've had since 2009. I was talking to a fellow YouTuber who recently passed away. His name was Lao Shu, or Moses McCormick. He also went by Musa. He was a Muslim convert. And he introduced me to Islam, said that he was Muslim. He had a Quran in Chinese because he liked studying Chinese. And so I said, wow, but this guy is really, really nice. He's really nice to me. Maybe Muslims are different than what I thought. And I started thinking back to like my childhood. And in Minnesota, we have a big Somali immigrant population. And I said, okay, every time I hung out with Somali people, they were really nice to me. They always treated me really good. So I said, okay, I guess I don't know anything about Islam. So maybe I should go read about it and learn about it. And that's what I did. I bought some basic books on it from like Bilal Phillips or something, was reading on Wikipedia about Tawheed, and I'm like, wow, this philosophically or theologically makes a lot of sense. It's very convincing. I, where I was living in a small town at the time, and it was so small, it didn't have its own bookstore. And so I drove 60 miles to go to Minneapolis and to like a bookstore there called Barnes and Noble. And I bought myself a Quran, and I started reading that, and the Quran itself convinced me. And I'm like, okay, I guess I believe in this now. So, I Googled, how do you become Muslim? Oh, you do this thing called the Shahada. So, okay, I'll go take a bath, and then I say this thing, and, and I eventually became Muslim. But that's kind of the story in a nutshell. And shortly after, my mom kicked me out of the house for becoming Muslim. And so I was homeless for a little while, hitchhiked my way to Minneapolis, got connected with a non-Muslim, or I mean a non-profit Muslim organization called Building Blocks. And they helped me find, there were two Arab Sudanis who actually took me in to live with them. And they were also, one of them was the official translator for Sheikh Walid bin Idris al-Manisi, who is the like dean of the Islamic University of Minnesota. He's like the biggest sheikh in this area. And so kind of from the beginning of my Islam, I was put in a very academic and serious type of study with a real alim who's respected internationally.
Mm-hmm.
So thinking back now, like it took me a long time to realize my convert experience was really different because of that. I used to have a hard time when I would meet new converts from like other regions of the United States. And I'd be like, how do you not know this like basic knowledge? And I'd be like confused. And I realized that the environment I converted in was way more academic than most places around the country.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess you had some advantage there, but your story is similar to mine, but not really, because I mean, I was a Catholic, raised as Catholic, and then I also became very atheistic in my, let's say, teenage years and in the college, and then I was never interested in any religion. I always viewed it as something evil. And then I became a Muslim after like a year and a half of studying, but my family actually embraced me very much, even though they're all Christian and they are very happy. But you've mentioned that you had had to become, leave your home, which must have been much more difficult than my story. Like nothing changed. Even my, I was living with a girlfriend for 7 years and we were not married. And she, we took the nikah. And so it was very easy for me. I don't know why it was like this, but my conversion, I mean, for me it was difficult, obviously, because like you're embracing a new faith, but the surrounding was not that difficult. I never had anything like you had. So I mean, it's pretty crazy to hear those kind of stories. Yeah. I just had a question, like, how long did it take you to study Islam before you took the Shahada? Like,
it was during my summer break after the first year of college. So I wasn't working. And so I could just read all day, every day, or like I remember watching YouTube videos of Yusuf Estes back when like it was like the first type of Islamic stuff on YouTube. And it was like Peace TV and I think it was called like Digital Minbar or something with Bilal Phillips. Like these are the first things about Islam that were on YouTube. There was nothing from the Sufi perspective. There was nothing from the Shi'i perspective. It was just kind of like this Salafi light, if you want to call it that, perspective that was on YouTube. And so I remember watching those videos, and there was one that was called like Lifting the Fog or something like that from Sheikh Yusuf Estes that really kind of dispelled a lot of stereotypes that Americans have about Islam that I found really intriguing. I remember watching that quite a bit. And I remember reading all the Wikipedia articles that I could find and eventually ordering off Amazon books from like Bilal Phillips. And I was in, college at the time at a very small local community college, like a vocational school, they also call it, that mostly focuses on jobs that'll put you like in industry or factories or kind of like technology. I was doing liberal arts, but they had a very small liberal arts department, but they did have a library, even though it was very small. And they had books on Islam. So they like had the book, Islam from Hans Kuhn, the German Orientalist and theologian, things like that. So I was able to read some of that stuff too. And but mainly it was just reading the Quran that really convinced me. It was the scripture itself that really kind of went straight to my aql and my qalb, right? The intellect and heart.
How do you know how to read Arabic now? After
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just trying to get into it. So how long did it take you to, learn how to maybe just read Arabic?
I mean, Arabic's a very hard language and it's a lifelong journey. So it's something that, like, I tell Muslims, you got to make it part of your worship. Like, consider it ibadah
Mm-hmm.
to learn Arabic, and just anticipate that it's something you'll be doing the rest of your life. Because it's very difficult, even for Arabs that grow up in an Arab country speaking
Mm-hmm.
like a dialect of Arabic. It's still very hard for them to learn classical Arabic, even though they have a Semitic language of their own that's, pretty close. Um, so I started learning it in like 2011, I believe. And I have some early videos of me trying to speak it on YouTube on my Hamza the Linguist channel. Um, and I think I have a couple videos that are just only in Arabic on my Hamza the Historian channel as well. But basically, learning to read the alphabet and pronounce the letters came fairly quick to me. I also went to the mosque and had a teacher who helped teach me that, and also taught me a little bit of like basic Arabic calligraphy, so you know how to write the letters properly. Um, and that had to be like 2010 maybe. I don't remember, exactly, because it's a little while ago. And I bought a lot of books like Teach Yourself Arabic or Colloquial Arabic type books,
Mm-hmm.
Pimsleur type, they're like commercially made manuals to like teach yourself a language. They used to come with CDs and stuff. And, but mainly I just kind of tried to learn the traditional way. So I'd go to the mosque and they would use the book called Durus al-Lugha al-Arabiya, which is the Al Medina University's textbook to teach foreigners Arabic. And I would go over that with a teacher. And I did the first two books with a teacher, and that gave me a real good foundation. And the longer you're in the Muslim community, the more you read Islamic books or listen to Islamic lectures, you start to pick up a lot of individual Arabic words. So my vocabulary became real expansive just by being in the Muslim community and actively studying. But what really, I think, solidified my Arabic was when I was doing my master's at the University of Chicago. They had a program that was a 1 year grammar intensive of Arabic. They just called it Quranic Arabic. It sounds very humble, but it was a very intense 1 year long class where we met, I think it was 4 or 5 days a week. And we focused heavily on Arabic grammar just to be able to read books.
Mm-hmm.
And so the teacher didn't care too much if some of the students had bad pronunciation. The idea was to be able to read with comprehension and to know the grammar well. We used a book called Tasheel al-Nahu, which means making grammar easy in Arabic. And we used a book called Al-Nahu al-Wadih, or the clear grammar. And that now I feel like I understand Arabic grammar like very well. And after I did that, I went to Egypt to study Arabic at like one of their Arabic institutes. And I was in class for 6 hours a day, just doing one-on-one tutoring.
Wow.
And it's pretty cheap in Egypt. There, the cost of living, everything there is very cheap. So it was more accessible to me to go there than like Jordan. Some people go to Jordan, or some people go to like the Emirates. Those are more expensive, but Egypt's more cheap. And I love Egyptian culture. The people are very nice. And Egyptian dialect's fun to learn as well, but it's a challenge of its own. And over there, I focused on just reading mostly classical texts. I did a little bit of modern standard just to communicate and talk about everyday type of things. And I did some dialect as well, so I could basically survive while I was there, because a lot of Egyptians, they don't really understand Fusha, the standard Arabic.
Mm-hmm.
Even in their college papers, they write them in their dialect, I found out.
Got
So
it.
that's kind of my journey with learning Arabic. And so basically, I really feel like it took me 10 years to get good at it.
Yeah, maybe some reverts or converts are listening and they're like, "Oh my God, 10 years!" But
Yeah,
yeah, I guess
you got to
that's
set your expectations just to do it the rest of your life.
yeah. I mean, it's all good. We're Muslims, alhamdulillah. So we're happy to be that. But maybe I had a question because you're also very well kind of uh, taught in history. You've studied Islamic history, which many people. I mean, we don't have any Islamic history in Europe. We are not taught about Islamic history here. We're only taught about European history or what happened in the US, but we're not really taught Islamic history. And for a convert coming from the Europe or US, it's difficult because we don't know anything. I have no knowledge of any Islamic history except the Quran and everything I've learned. I don't know any battles that happened. I have no idea what happened with Israel and Palestine. Like these things are missing. I'm missing the context. And so then some people ask me what I think about these things. I have no idea because, I'm not, informed enough. So why is it important maybe for converts, to study Islamic history? And how did you go about it in the beginning? Which books maybe would you recommend, or how do you basically get into it?
Yeah, so I had done pretty much like a whole bachelor's in Islamic studies without really knowing much about history. So, I learned like some basic texts of like, Sharia or Fiqh, like some basic texts of how to pray, how to fast, how to make wudu, and those types of things, like the 5 pillars, and some basic theology texts like al-Aqidah, Tahawiyya, and these types of things. But you don't, in the Madrasa or traditional way of learning, you don't learn really the historical context. Now, a lot of the big ulama that I've met overseas, they do know history, but I think they kind of learn it more through osmosis of like, in an Arabic book that is like let's say, usul fiqh book or something. In the introduction, the editor will give you a little bit of historical background of where the book's coming from. Unfortunately, in a lot of English translations of these Arabic books, they don't do that. But in Arabic, they do that. So like the ulama, they kind of have a better sense of history than like a sheikh in America would, which I've noticed. So I didn't know very much history, and it wasn't until I was in the last year of my bachelor's degree in linguistics. It was called St. Cloud State University in central Minnesota. I had some room for elective classes that I could take whatever subject I wanted. So for the first time, they offered an introduction to Islam in their religious studies department. And they also, first time I ever seen it, offered Middle East history through their history department. And the people who taught them, they were not specialists in Islam. That was not their main field of expertise. So the one lady who was teaching Islam in the religious studies department, that adjunct instructor, she had a Ph.D. specializing in Judaism studies or Jewish studies. And the one who taught Islamic history through the Middle East department, her PhD focused on French history, medieval history of monasteries. And so it wasn't their area of expertise. And so when I came there, I could speak on, the Islamic texts that I had studied and the things I knew about Islam. But at the same time, I realized that, wow, there's a whole field of study of Islamic studies in a secular university as well, that I could bring my expertise from traditional studies and bring it to this field, and also be able to, do well academically. And I realized that there's a lot to Islamic history that most Muslims don't know by just reading kind of the basic books that they had for those classes. And so one that I like to recommend is kind of an introductory book. It's called A History of Islamic Societies by Ira Lapidus. He's a professor at Berkeley University. And, it's an Orientalist book, but it gives you a pretty good overview of Islamic history, and it covers all the different regions of the world. And There's also a book that's a 3-volume book by Professor Hodgson from the University of Chicago that's called The Venture of Islam, that someone could read after that. And so these will kind of give you an introduction to it. And when you get better at Arabic, you can start reading kind of the Arab histories. You have Tariq al-Tabari, as it's known, the history of Tabari. That's also been translated into English, but it's like so many volumes in English, and they sell the volumes individually. So if you go on like Amazon, each volume is like $20 or something.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really expensive. It's almost impossible for like a normal person to buy the entire set. But if you're interested in one part of Islamic history, you could buy just that volume. And of course, there is free PDFs floating around the internet of Tariq al-Tabari that you could find, with the English translation. So you can read it that way. But those are usually the books I tell people to start with. And I have a video on my channel, Hamza the Historian, where I recommend kind of the basic books to get started with.
Right. Do you think it's like many people who embrace Islam are missing this context, the history, or
most
what did
Muslims
you
in
notice?
general, if they're a convert or they're born Muslim, even if they went to a madrasa, or even if they are well advanced in their Islamic studies, they usually, in my experience, when I talk to them, they don't know the history of the text that they're studying. And I find it really problematic, because when you have a text that says, certain things, and you don't know the historical context in which that book was written, you're going to misunderstand it. And so if a book is saying something, like a sheikh in a book says something really harsh or really extreme, it might be because of the political circumstances of his time or the social circumstances of his time. Like maybe there was a problem that everybody knew was a big problem in society. And so he talked about it, expecting his audience to know that.
Mm-hmm.
But then you read the book today in our modern times, where that problem doesn't exist anymore, and you would never know that reading the statement, and you might completely misunderstand it.
Yeah, definitely. You've mentioned a couple of words, madrasa. How would you describe, or to somebody who doesn't know what this is?
So madrasa is basically a traditional Islamic school, and essentially they started rising around the 11th century is when they started becoming very prominent in the Muslim world, and that's 11th century Gregorian. And they, in the old days, they were funded by waqf, which is sort of like a nonprofit that someone would, like a rich person would donate a chunk of land that you could grow agriculture on, and the crops would be sold, and the profits would fund a local madrasa. Mm-hmm. And would fund the students, would pay for the sheikh's salary, would give the students maybe a stipend or food and housing and those types of things. So it kind of became like a college system, or the college system that arose in Europe was directly modeled after the Islamic madrasa system. And so George Maqdisi, he was I believe, Egyptian professor, or maybe some other Arab country. He was a professor anyways in the United States, George Maqdisi, and he wrote a book called like The Rise of the Colleges. And he traces the history of the Islamic madrasa school system and how it impacted European college system. Because we had Al-Azhar universities in Morocco and elsewhere that were very prominent before Europe ever developed universities. And Europeans used to come to the Muslim world to study medicine and things like that.
Yeah. Also in Spain, there was Cordova, I think, University, which was the first one in Andalusia by Muslims, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. And we've mentioned also fiqh. So maybe for people, maybe some non-Muslims are watching this, or people who are just interested in Islam, what is fiqh? How would you describe this to somebody?
So first we have to understand the word Sharia. And Sharia,
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people have heard the word before, Sharia law, Sharia law. But really, linguistically, what it means in Arabic is it's the path to something good or the path to water. And the Arabic word for street, even now, is shari'. So shari' and sharia, it's the same root. Okay. So they're very related. It's the path to something good. Basically, it refers to Islamic ethics and ritual.
Mm-hmm.
And sharia is kind of like the abstract idea of God's commands and prohibitions, what God wants us to do and wants us to avoid in that very abstract sense. And fiqh, it literally means trying to have a deep understanding of something. And so fiqh is the human endeavor to try and understand what Sharia is. And so it's the human interpretation of God's law or what God wants us to do or prohibits us from doing.
Mm-hmm. So how did fiqh develop maybe from the beginnings? Was this, already in place in early Islamic history, or is this something recent?
So during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he was the one who was the authority interpreting the Quran and telling people what the proper way to behave was, and everybody wanted to follow his tradition or the Sunnah, his
Mm-hmm.
example. And when after he passed away, peace be upon him, you had the Khulafa Rashidun, or the early first four caliphs in Islamic history. And they also kind of set a lot of precedents as to how a government should function, how law should be. For instance, there was a famine during Omar's time. And because of this famine, he had to fix market prices. So it is permissible in Islam to control market prices, for instance. He set that precedent. And during the Umayyad period, which came after the Khulafa Rashidun, a lot of Islamic law was revolving around warfare and fighting and conquest and war booty. They call it ghanima.
Mm-hmm.
And so the earliest kind of texts that we have are from his name is Imam al-Awza'i, and he was an Umayyad era jurist, and he lived during the Abbasid revolution and a little bit into the Abbasid times as well. And he was kind of a contemporary of Abu Hanifa. And most of what his text talks about is war booty. How do you divide it? How do you get it? Or there's certain things like if you find these Christian books or books from a Christian that are written in Greek and you don't know how to read Greek, you don't know if these books have something haram in them, forbidden, or something blasphemous in them. So you're afraid to sell them because you don't want to get sin. So what should you do with them? Imam Awza'i said, let's just go bury them somewhere in the desert. So, it's kind of, in a sense, some Orientalists say it was like an ad hoc law, that you make the law as certain situations arose on the battlefield, essentially. That was the beginning of it. And then when you had the Abbasid revolution happen and the Umayyads were toppled over, it started becoming more of an imperial type situation where territories were being consolidated, and it was more concerned about maintaining the empire rather than just a quick expansion like they had during the Umayyad times. And so Harun al-Rashid, who was the caliph, he wanted to make like an imperial law, a law that applied throughout the whole caliphate. And so Abu Hanifa's student, Muhammad bin al-Hasan al-Shaybani, he worked closely with Harun al-Rashid in order to make like an imperial law code, if you will. And so he wrote what's now called Kitab al-Asl, or like the book of the fundament. Asl just means like the basis. It literally is the roots, the base, the trunk of a tree, like in Arabic. Yeah, so you have asl is the roots and the trunk, and then furu' is the branches, or fara', singular. And so It's kind of like the basis of law is what his book was supposed to be. The book that every other jurist is supposed to consult if they're going to work for the government. And it's in modern print, it's 12 volumes. It's my area of expertise. That's where I'm trying to specialize and do my PhD dissertation on that book in particular. And you find in it, the majority of what we know as fiqh or Islamic law today is in that book. And every jurist after that was kind of building off that book. I think it was Imam al-Shafi'i who came a little later, and he was a student of Muhammad Shaybani. He said that everybody is dependent on Muhammad bin al-Hassan Shaybani, on his work. The Arabic word he says is ayal, like that. It's also the same word for children. Like we're all just dependent children on his work. We have
What's
to
the name of the
consult
book? Just one more time. What's the name of the book?
It's called Kitab al-Asl.
Okay.
It has a nickname al-Mabsut too. So some later Hanafis call it al-Mabsut.
Mm-hmm.
And so Hanafi Muftis, even now, that's the first book they're supposed to consult on any fiqh issue. And if they don't find the issue in that book, then they might go to other books.
Yeah. And so basically, as far as we should understand it, basically you have Sharia, but Sharia is interpreted differently through fiqh in different contexts in different countries. Like, for example, in Bosnia, there's different Sharia than it's in Indonesia, and then what's happening in Saudi is completely different as well. So how would you maybe explain this, that every country kind of interprets the Sharia differently, you know? I don't know, have you studied this sort of process?
Yeah, so there's 4 canonical schools that we have nowadays of Islamic law in Sunni Islam.
Mm-hmm.
And they call them the 4 madhhabs, or schools of thought. And madhab is plural. And so you have the Hanafi madhab, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali, and they all have their own histories, and they're named after their founders and these types of things. The most populous, like the most followed by population or numerically by far, has always been the Hanafi madhab, because it was typically the ones that Islamic governments used as their official school. So it's very widespread across the Muslim world, and the most widely followed. Second most widely followed is the Maliki school, which started in Medina. It used to be the dominant school in Saudi Arabia before the Wahhabi movement. And it's dominant all across North and West Africa as well. And then the Shafi'i madhab, Imam Shafi'i eventually settled in Egypt. So Egypt, about 60% of them are Shafi'i, and the other ones follow different schools. But it's still kind of the main school, like at Azhar University, and the main one that is culturally commonly known amongst Egyptians. All of East Africa is Shafi'i, because also a lot of the Sunnis that are in Yemen are Shafi'i, especially in Hadramaut. And the Hadrami people, they're very famous for being sea traders, and they would trade with everybody on the Indian Ocean. So they have communities that in India where they would settle there, marry women there. And there's parts of India that is Shafi'i because of that. Indonesia converted to Islam and became Shafi'i through the Hadramis. And so usually around the Indian Ocean area, you'll see a lot of Shafi'ism. And then after that is Hanbalism, which historically was always the smallest school. In the medieval period, it was even so small that in the medieval times, they talked about the 3 canonical schools. They didn't even recognize it really as a school so much. I mean, if you asked them about it, they would say, yes, it's a valid school, but it was so much not on their radar, not in their thought, because it was so small in number, they rarely encountered these people. But when we had the Wahhabi movement start in the 1800s in Saudi Arabia, it spread in Arabia, and now it's like a school that everyone knows about and talks about and deals with. And that's the one I originally studied when I converted to Islam. I now am a practicing Hanafi, but I still very much like both and study both. And so that's kind of in short the differences as far as kind of the abstract scholarly thought. But then you might even have the same school, like the Hanafi school, the one that's the most widespread. Different cultures will interpret it differently. And every culture has different issues that they're working with and different things that they're going to emphasize. So,
so maybe one question. So what do you think is the source of all these differences? If there's one Sharia, why are there so many schools, so many branches? Isn't it like somebody who maybe don't understand this, like, isn't there just one Quran? I mean, there's many Hadiths and everything, but like, why are there so many schools of, thoughts on this?
So in every religious tradition, you have what's called hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is a fancy word of saying like interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
And so in a verse in Quran, it might be slightly ambiguous. And so scholars who were like experts in Arabic linguistics in the medieval period, they would debate as to what's going on grammatically in that verse of Quran. And so they'd say, well, if you understand the grammar this way, it changes the meaning completely.
Mm-hmm.
So there'd be two competing ideas as to what the verse means grammatically. Sometimes they would also debate what the meaning of a certain word was. Does this word mean fish specifically, meaning that it has scales and fins, or does it mean any type of sea creature? And they would debate that. So in the Hanafi school, they don't eat lobsters, they don't eat crabs or shrimp, because the Quran, they say, is talking about fish that is halal, not every sea creature.
Mm-hmm.
Where the other schools will say, no, that word to us means every sea creature. And so that is the first point, is you have linguistic differences.
Mm-hmm.
And then besides that, they have different epistemologies, which is kind of a fancy word for saying their worldview, or the way that they grade evidences, like which evidence is stronger than another piece of evidence, or what happens when you have things that contradict each other. So they have different methods of dealing with that as well. For instance, in the Hanafi madhab, with hadith, it has to be a strong, like a certain strength to use for fiqh. So a hadith, or a narration from the Prophet, during the early period, it has to have 3 completely separate chains of narration. And it has to be something that the people knew about and were doing. It was like a widely known
What does it mean when you say 3 different sets of narration? Can you explain that?
So you have what's called a sanad, or a chain of narration, where it's like Muhammad said, and this is narrated from this guy, from
Mm-hmm.
this guy, from this guy, from this guy. And so you would check that to make sure those people actually met each other. You check to make sure those people were trustworthy, practicing, Muslims that were just and not doing crimes, or not liars or things like that. And so that would be one chain of narration. And so they would want 3 completely separate, so totally different people,
Mm-hmm.
but the same hadith, the same narration, it's the same teaching from
So the
Prophet
people would
Muhammad.
be unrelated, basically. They wouldn't had a chance to know each other. And the science behind these research of hadiths, it sounds pretty difficult, to be honest, like to look this up and to really verify all this data. Do you know how this is done, basically, just from a high level perspective?
Yeah, so there's like huge multi-volume books that are like biographical dictionaries.
Mm-hmm.
Like Bukhari has one, I think it's just called Tarikh al-Bukhari or something like that, where it's huge multi-volume work in Arabic, and it'll have a biography of all the different figures that they see in these hadith chains.
Mm-hmm.
And so a hadith scholar would go and look at that and could figure out the biography of when someone was born, when they died, if they're considered trustworthy or not, if they're considered a liar, if they did major crimes during their life, and those types of things. Because sometimes you might have a 7-year-old child who's narrating a hadith. And so was that child known for being highly intelligent and known for transmitting things without lying or making mistakes? Was his accuracy of transmission well known, and things like that? Or sometimes it might be the case that, this person was a young child. He wasn't known for being very accurate in his transmission, but he's talking about a horse, the Prophet's horse, peace be upon him. The horse stayed on his house, like the horse lived on his property. He's seen it every day growing up as a kid, so probably he knows about it. So you kind of have that historical or biographical information to grade whether a hadith is actually sahih, like sound or not. And so sometimes some people have modern scholars like Sheikh Albani later in Saudi Arabia, he wanted to say some hadith in Sahih Bukhari were weak. And so some other scholars rebutted him and said, no, there's other historical factors that we that are looked at, such as this horse example that I just gave. Albani tried to say that was a weak hadith, and the other scholar says, no, that horse lived on this guy's house when he was a child, so he probably knows about it.
Yeah. And so you've mentioned different grades like epistemology. So some societies viewed sources differently. So what do you know about any grading? Like, let's say, is hadith narration versus something that's in Quran? What's more important? Or
it's a very complicated thing. So I can only give you, like bits and pieces, and everything I say is kind of going to be oversimplified. But essentially, like in the Hanafi madhab, they will look at the hadith as being lower than the Quran. And if a hadith contradicts the Quran, like a Quranic verse, they will throw it out. They'll say it's invalid. It contradicts the Quran. How could we use it? Whereas in the Shafi'i madhab, they say if a hadith appears to contradict a verse of Quran, it's actually explaining that verse. It's further specifying what that verse means. So they prefer kind of to specify things further. The Hanafis prefer the general rule over specifying it. So instead of specifying, they're going to prefer the general, which is called am in Arabic. The specified they call khas.
Right. And in terms of tafsir, how is this different than fiqh then?
So tafsir in English, it's a very fancy sounding word. It's exegesis. And it's a Greek word, but it's an explanation of what the verses in Quran mean. And tafsir is a very big field. There's people who approach the Quran from many different perspectives. So you have tafasir, which is the plural. You have tafasir, which are about just Islamic law. So they'll look at the verses only from the perspective of Islamic law. So you have Tafsir al-Jassas, who is a famous Hanafi scholar, and he looks at the verses of Quran just from the Hanafi perspective. And you also have like a Tafsir al-Kabir, as it's known, from Fakhruddin al-Razi, and it just has everything in it. He's got mathematics in it. He's got philosophy in it. He's got Islamic theology. He's got Islamic law. It's just got everything. And it even might have some narrations from Christian or Jewish sources in it. They call it Israeliyat. And so it's a very, encyclopedic book. And I like that one. I like reading it quite a bit. You have other ones that just focus on, maybe theology, or some of them, like the new modern trend that scholars have been doing the past 100 years is called Tafsir al-Mawdu'i, which means thematic tafsir or thematic exegesis, where they just look at certain themes of the Quran, and they'll bring all the verses that talk about this one topic, this one subject, and then they'll go subject by subject by subject.
Is there a way to, I was just curious if there's a way to not have bias in tafsir, like if there's a way to prevent that, because, how can we make sure this doesn't happen?
Well, I mean, it's just understood that tafsir and fiqh, these are human endeavors done by people that are not ma'asum, which in English means infallible. These are people who can make mistakes. There's a hadith from the Prophet, Kulli ibn Adam khata. Every human being will make mistakes. So basically, they will make their arguments, but people can refute their arguments. Other scholars do that to each other all the time in the Islamic tradition. So that's why there is different schools of thoughts. And there always was a culture of debate and discussion and open-mindedness.
Yeah.
You can still have your opinion, but, you know, try your best to respect other opinions, because they're also well argued out, you know, both sides.
Right. And I had a question about fatwas. So, do you know the process behind issuing a fatwa just from a high level perspective for people who maybe haven't heard about this? Maybe you can tell us what is fatwa actually.
So fatwa, the English word that they use is derived from Latin. It's responsum. And fatawa, the plural, they say responsa. So if you want to look those words up, you can do that, you know, with Google, because they also use those words for like in the Jewish tradition, because they also have fatwas essentially. And so you have what's called a mufti, and the mufti is the person who makes a fatwa. In English, they usually call that person a jurisconsult. So a mufti is probably the highest level, you know, in the law that someone can get. It's very high level. It means that you have studied the law, and also kind of you're an expert in how it's applied, and you're an expert in researching new rules in the law. And so it's a very complicated process that I'm still studying myself. But essentially, every madhab has kind of like a basic book that they call the genre of literature, or the type of literature, as adab al-mufti, or the manners that a mufti should have. And basically, it's a little manual as to how they should construct fatawa. And in the Hanafi tradition, Ibn Abidin, who is a scholar of the 1800s in the Ottoman Empire, is kind of like the main authority figure for modern Hanafism. He wrote a book that's called Sharh Uqud Rasm al-Mufti, which is like an explanation of a poem that he wrote that gives you all the ways a mufti should act and what sources they should consult. So they would start with Kitab al-Asl from Muhammad Shaybani, like I mentioned, and then they might go to the later kind of more medieval scholars that were based in Central Asia predominantly, like Fatawa Qadi Khan, or these other, you know, fatwa collections that existed, and shuruh, like bigger commentaries. And so there's this whole system of place of which books you consult. If you don't find something in that book, what's the next book that you go to? You don't find nothing there, what's the next level of books that you go to? And it's quite a lot of literature that you have to consult before trying to make your own fatwa. Because a lot of times these issues have actually already been written about by a mufti in the past, even maybe 500 or 1,000 years ago, very similar to what we might be experiencing now. If it's still something that's not found in any of the past literature, then you would do your own, what's called ijtihad, or legal reasoning, to try to formulate what is the proper thing to do in this situation. And they have all kinds of tools in order to do that. So they would look at, okay, what do all the Quranic verses say? Do any of them contradict one another? Then they'll work through the contradictions. What do all the hadith that are authentic say? How strong are they? Do they contradict each other? And they'll go through that entire corpus of literature. Then they might look at one point, did any of the Sahaba or early jurists have a consensus? They call ijma' on this subject. Did they decide on this subject already? And then you can also look at what's called qiyas, or analogical reasoning or deduction. So for instance, in the Quran, it uses the word khamr for fermented grapes, meaning wine. And it says wine is forbidden.
Mm-hmm.
But what about beer? Beer isn't made from fermented grapes. Well, they would say, well, why was wine prohibited? It was prohibited because it intoxicates. Beer also intoxicates. Therefore, it's forbidden as well. And that's what they call qiyas, or analogical reasoning. And after that, they might go to what's called istihsan. In the Hanafi madhab, it means seeking the good. The different madhabs have different names for it, but it's essentially the same thing. It's seeking the maslaha, or what's good for society. So you may implement a rule from Sharia in society as a law, but it has the opposite effect that it was intended to do.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say maybe this law was supposed to make people drive slower so there's less car accidents or something. It has the opposite effect. There's more car accidents, even though people may be driving slower. So they say, okay, for the greater good, we need to change this. And so they will change it to have the intended effect so there's less car accidents. So that's another part of Islamic law too. And then also one thing they would consider is urf, or custom or culture. If a culture does something really different than another, then they will change the rule so that it fits their culture in a sense. And so, for instance, in Arab culture, it was a very tribal culture where if someone murdered another person illegally, and they were caught and it was confirmed that person killed the other person, like it was all proven and everything like that through a court of law, mm-hmm. then the whole the tribe of the killed person, they should be getting money from the other tribe of the murderer. They call it blood money or diya.
Yeah.
However, when Hanafi jurists in Central Asia, like Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, and these places later on in the medieval period, were reading this stuff, they said, we don't have a tribal culture over here. It's more individualistic. No tribe is going to help each other like that. No one's going to pay money out like that. And so they changed the rules where it was the individual murderer who had to pay.
Right.
And so each country, even now, kind of has stuff like that. Like when you get married, the nikah, you're supposed to give a mahr or a dowry paid to the wife. In Egyptian culture, it's customary that you don't have to pay all of it right away. You do what's called a muqaddama or a down payment. And so for them, that's how the law is. But in other, like in Saudi Arabia, they expect it all up front. You can't get married till you have all that money ready. Mm-hmm. So culture can also play a role in how these laws work too.
Yeah.
Family law is probably the only place left in a lot of Muslim countries nowadays where Sharia is more closely followed. A lot of it was replaced by the colonizers to like a French type of system or some sort of secular system. And there's a professor, Talal Asad, at Columbia University in New York, who's written a lot about this process, about secularization in the Muslim world. And he's the son of a very famous Muslim convert called Muhammad Asad, who translated the Quran into English. And he was from Austria. His original name was Leopold Weiss. Mm-hmm. And so I think these are important figures that Muslims should look into nowadays too, because we have to understand the history of colonization and how it's affected us. Because the reality is we don't really have Sharia law as a everyday thing for us anymore.
Yeah.
It's just more of an ethical thing that we practice amongst ourselves and not a governmental thing.
Yeah, exactly. I was just looking up some, you have every year these statistics about how Muslim world is lacking behind the West. And then if you look at the constitution of countries like Pakistan or something, they are not based on Sharia anymore, based on the English law or based on, the European law. And they instilled that law there. And the barbaricism that they are claiming to do, they actually put it there. It's not from Sharia. So it's pretty crazy how that works.
The honor killings and weird things like that, they have nothing to do with Sharia.
Yeah, exactly. I was just calling actually a Mufti yesterday because I was getting married and there was mahar and all these things. So I know that this is my first call, but like these Muftis, is it like there can be like a million of them, or is it just like a few of them? Do you know any statistics?
I mean, I don't know the total number of muftis around the world, but there are a lot of qualified people out there. Sometimes I think for a lay person, it may be hard to find them or figure out who they are and where they are, but they do exist. Like in Chicago, there's hundreds of them just in Chicago alone, hundreds of Hanafi muftis. In Minnesota, there, Sheikh Walid, I consider him a mufti, and I think he might not, out of humility call himself that, but he can issue fatwas. And so, I mean, I met the Grand Mufti of Albania. He came to Chicago when I was a student there to the university and gave a presentation. So, I mean, there are muftis out there. I would say in Muslim countries, there may be even thousands in each country,
Do you
at least
think,
hundreds.
right? Do you think that Sharia law, in terms of like a government, can ever come back in any of these Muslim countries, or is it?
It's a very difficult question because it seems like the more a country wants to do Sharia, the more there's kind of some international resistance to it. And the Ottoman Empire, at the very end stage of the empire, they had created a legal code that was based on the Hanafi madhab. They called the Mujalla, al Mujalla. And that was right before the Ottoman Empire was kind of disbanded and you had Ataturk take it over.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of the closest thing that we've ever had to like an Islamic law state in the modern world. But there is a theorist. He's a non-Muslim. I think he's a Christian Arab. His name is Wa'il Halaq, and he's researched Islamic law pretty much all his life. And now he's drifted more towards philosophy and studying philosophy. And he's thought a lot about this question. Can we have a modern state that practices Sharia law? And for the most part, his conclusion is no, because a lot of what philosophically undergirds a modern state is incompatible with Sharia. So he has a book called The Impossible State that he wrote through Columbia University Press, and it was like a top seller, where he argues that the modern nation state, as theorized by Enlightenment philosophers in the West, that's become the dominant international paradigm, it's not compatible with the Sharia paradigm. It's just too different. You can maybe bring parts of Sharia into it, but it's still at the end of the day a modern state, and still at the end of the day functions as a modern state, even though it has elements of Sharia. Sharia at its core is totally different. So it's a tricky question that people are still debating today. Some Muslims, they refute that and they say, no, it is possible to have a modern Sharia state, and they cite the Ottoman Mujalla law code. And it's been translated into multiple European languages too, because they wanted people, for international business people to come to the Ottoman Empire and know what the law was. So it's like in French and English and German and those types of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if people say in the West that, oh, we're scared of the Sharia law, are they basically saying something impossible because it can never kind of overtake the modern state in their country if the Muslims are a minority, let's say?
Well, I think one of the biggest things that non-Muslims do not know is that Sharia law from the very beginning has always said that you follow the laws of the land that you're in. If you're in a non-Muslim country, you have to follow those laws as long as they're not commanding you to do something forbidden or preventing you from doing something that is wajib or mandatory. Like they can't stop you from praying 5 times a day.
Mm-hmm.
But if they tell you you can't marry more than one wife, well, then don't marry more than one wife. That's not a requirement in our religion, for instance. So we're supposed to follow the speed limit. We're supposed to, in America, wear our seat buckles because it's the law and those things, when we drive. So we're not in no way able to change, able to overtake a country. That's against our own religion as far as making Sharia, like the law of the land, illegally in a country. But that's like a big contradiction. It's an oxymoron. It doesn't make sense.
Right. Yeah, I guess only if like 99% of the country decided that we'll write a constitution based on Sharia law, but I guess that's like a non-existent thought at this moment.
Well, there's treaties that the Prophet Muhammad made when he was in Medina, peace be upon him. And you have what's called the Treaty of Hudaybiyah that they made with the Meccans. And some Orientalists try to say oh, this is a constitution. This was the Constitution of Medina. But it's not really a constitution. That's kind of like an Orientalist projection onto the Islamic tradition. It's more, Islamically, it was considered more of like an agreement or a treaty or something kind of that nature. Constitution is totally a Western concept that has nothing to do with Islamic civilization.
Mm-hmm.
So even the idea of having a constitution is kind of problematic. But some scholars, they might say, well, yeah, it's not something indigenous to Islamic civilization, but it's not forbidden per se either. It's not haram. There's ways you could do a constitution that's still halal, even though it's from a different culture. So it's still like an open debate.
Right.
So
Go
there's a
ahead.
famous Syrian scholar. He lives in America now, I believe. His name's Muhammad Yaqubi. And he wrote this book famously called Refuting ISIS. And he talks about all their extreme points and where they're wrong. And he's kind of more of an advocate for having a democracy and constitution. And he says that Islam supports that.
Mm-hmm. Right. In terms of fatwas, one more question. Once it's, let's say, released, there needs to be a consensus to accept it, right? Because I think I've read this, that even bin Laden had a fatwa on 9/11, but it wasn't rejected by the majority of people. So how does this work? Do you know anything about
So
this
basically, a fatwa is a recommendation. It's an expert opinion on what somebody should do. And it might tell you it's mandatory to do such and such, or it's mandatory to avoid such and such. But it's just an opinion that's non-binding. You do not have to follow it.
Mm-hmm.
There may be other fatwas on the same subject that say something different. So it just depends how much you trust that scholar. And when you trust a scholar and you follow their expert knowledge, they call that taqlid, which is kind of like just another word for saying you follow that scholar.
Got it. Okay, and maybe last question: how's life in a non-Muslim country? Like after 11 years, what do you prefer to live there, or have you tried? You lived in Egypt before, but how do you think people, Muslims like us, living in the West, let's say somewhere, how can we live in those countries? Secular, atheistic, at least where I am. And still kind of, practice the religion. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, just more like a personal question.
Yeah, one of the things that I've noticed a lot of converts from the West will do is they kind of, not only do they romanticize Islamic history and romanticize and mythologize the past, and when it really wasn't like that when you study it, I also do the same thing to Muslim countries in the here and now in contemporary times. And the reality is a lot of the problems that I thought were unique to like America or Muslims living in the West are problems that Muslims are facing in their own countries too. Like when I was in Egypt, I was kind of shocked when I saw the bathroom. The toilet's right next to the bathtub. You have to still make wudu in a sink. There's no like special wudu station or equipment. It's exactly the same as like living here in that regard. Where Islamically, the toilet should be in a separate room from the bathtub. That's another story, a whole another, fiqh discussion. But they did do some things that were a little different. The washing machine was in the kitchen. Whereas an American household, the washing machine, it may be completely maybe next to the bathroom, in the bathroom, or in a separate room altogether, but never in the kitchen. A lot of Muslim women there wore pants. Some of them didn't wear hijab at all. So that type of thing is, we try to say, oh, like in the West, we just see everything and nobody's dressed, and that's a fitna, and it's difficult for us. A lot of Muslim countries, it's not much different. According to most schools of thought in Islam, dogs are considered impure ritually. So like if you get dog hair on you, you got to remove it before you can pray and things like that. But in Egypt, where the Shafi'i school is dominant, the Shafi'i school is the most conservative when it comes to dogs, yet everybody there has dogs now. People walking down the street with their German Shepherd and things like that. So a lot of the problems we think that are unique to the West is really happening everywhere. In Muslim countries, they have a lot of these problems too. It may be slightly less amount, you know, like you might see maybe 20% of the women in Egypt wearing niqab, maybe 50% wear hijab and abaya. But still, these issues exist, and people, I feel like Arab culture just is really nice in general. And they have a lot of the Islamic, you know, adab and akhlaq, like manners and ethics and things. But sometimes you'll meet some people that are really ill-mannered and really rude too. And when you're a tourist, they see you as a rich person. They just want to take advantage of you and exploit you, not tell you the real prices, just take your money and things like that. And for me, I just like, okay, whatever, it's a small price to pay. I come from a richer country than them, you know, whatever. That's my privilege in that regard. But, you know, a lot of the things that we think may be unique to the West are happening there too. When I was there at the bookstore in like the bazaar or the traditional market, they called it Suq al-Azbakiya, I saw Game of Thrones books everywhere. They were selling Mein Kampf from Hitler, and they had a portrait of Hitler hanging in the bookstore. There were people that liked Hitler. You know, they had books in French, they had books in German, they had all the like European languages, they had English books, and it was hard to find Islamic books. I was kind of shocked at how difficult, even when I went to Azhar University there and looked at the bookstores around there. I mean, went there to visit. I wasn't a student at the university. All the bookstores around there, it was very hard to find high-level Islamic books. They're very rare and difficult to find. And I guess not that many of them are printed, and they're also very expensive. So, you know, a lot of the problems that we think we have over here in terms of accessing Islamic knowledge, they have over there too. Like it was difficult for me to find like a real big sheikh or a real big alim when I was in Egypt. A lot of the mosques I went to, the person didn't even know how to speak standard Arabic, but they're leading the prayers and they're reciting Quran. But if I would speak to them in like Fusha, they wouldn't understand me. I would have to use dialect with them.
Yeah.
And but when I would go to like the Azhar, they call it Jami' al-Azhar, like the mosque and the old Azhar, they call it. You know, I met some famous sheikhs there and listened to some of their like classes they were teaching and things, like some lectures they were giving. But it was pretty difficult to find like real shuyukh and make a really, like it takes time, just like it would here in the United States. There's sheikhs here in the United States that are extremely knowledgeable, that are internationally recognized ulama, but it takes time to find them and make a relationship. And I assume the same is true in Europe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this was a lot of knowledge that you gave us, which is perfect. I have a lot of notes, so I'm definitely gonna buy some books and start reading because I don't know many things, and maybe my questions were too basic. But you know, as a new revert, you know, I need to learn, and I live in a country where we have only 3 mosques in the entire country, and Islam is very, very difficult here. People hate it, so. But anyways, thank you so much for stopping by and giving us these insights, and hopefully we can catch up some other time and talk again.
Inshallah, sounds good.
Inshallah. Thank you.